Over 20 years ago, one of the most fascinating places in the world was turned into a park. Memorialized today only in photographs, the Kowloon Walled City was a special place, a relic of Hong Kong's colonial days. In this video, we look back at the history of the Kowloon Walled City. Walled beginnings. The Kowloon Walled City did not always look like how it did near the end of its existence. For over 130 years of its 150-year-long existence, it looked much like an ordinary slum. But the unique circumstances around its founding nevertheless made it a destination for foreign curiosity seekers for over a century. And I agree that I don't really have photographs from things back in over 130 years ago. So for the most part, enjoy these pretty cool pictures I found of the walled city as it was right before its demolition. The foundation of what would eventually be the walled city began in 1668 with a small signal station in the northeastern corner of the Kowloon Peninsula. At that time, it was just one of many such stations, and there was absolutely nothing special or interesting about it. This remained the case until the British came to nearby Hong Kong Island in 1841. After the ratification of the unequal Treaty of Nanking and the British occupation of Hong Kong, the Qing moved their local assistant magistrate, the guy responsible for the administrative duties of about 491 villages in the local area, to the small Kowloon signal station town. This station town, which is really more of a barracks for troops and officials, took on brand new duties and newfound importance. The Governor-General of Guangdong in 1846, a few years later, it was recorded noting that the settlement seemed rather exposed and needed some better protections due to the proximity of the British. He proposed building additional accommodations for troops, offices, and a few fortifications, like a wall or something. He felt this show of strength would help restrain the foul British barbarians. The wall was built a year later, and the Kowloon Walled City was born. Historical records report that the namesake wall of the Kowloon Walled City was a wall. British visitors to the site write that the wall enclosed about 6.5 acres of space and was about 700 feet by 400 feet. It was made of granite and averaged about 13 feet high. It had 6 watchtowers and 4 gateways with doors of reinforced wood. The wall had a few parapets and cannon behind them. It was just a wall. I can't believe I'm spending so much time talking about this wall. It was a wall. 50 more years passed. For the most part, things stayed as they were. British and other Europeans hiking on the Kowloon Peninsula would often mark the walled city as the end point of their hikes, presumably taking hella selfies with their 19th century iPhones once they got there. During the devastating Taiping Civil War, the Longhairs attacked the Kowloon Walled City, and the officials fled to nearby Hong Kong Island colony. The British offered them shelter, which is a rare event of official collaboration between the two. By the time the 1890s rolled around, there lived about 500 people in the Kowloon Walled City. In 1899, though, things changed again. The Convention of Peking had gone into effect, and the British took administration over the new territories, the land south of what is now the Shenzhen River. The lease would last 99 years, or as the treaty's author wrote, effectively forever. During the time the treaty was signed, the Qing insisted that the Kowloon Walled City remain even as it would be engulfed and surrounded by British-held territory. The British at the time agreed, triggering the consent of everyone in the colony. It makes intuitive sense who wants to leave a foreign-controlled armed enclave in the middle of their new territory. The matter got more difficult as the British tried to pacify the natives already residing in the new territories. Over time, the British came to believe that the 600 soldiers living in the walled city were aiding the new territories' tribes' resistance and sent a 300-man force on May 16th at 3 p.m. to empty out the walled city and eject their soldiers back to the mainland. They were successful. The Hong Kong authorities unilaterally issued an order legalizing their actions, extending their colonial authority over the walled city. The Chinese, as you would expect, was not thrilled by this development. The Governor-General felt humiliated and demanded amelioration, but the government, for whatever reason, did not launch a counterattack. But the Qing never ratified this illegal eviction either, thus creating a lasting dissonance between the two sides. Emptied of its purpose, the city fell into disarray. A few people still lived there, but it never regained its prior glory days. The place remained largely a tourist destination, a place for foreigners to see what life looked like in ancient Qing China. In 1933, the Hong Kong government proposed not renewing the leases of several pig farms within the walled city. and proposed tearing down the place entirely. Citing unsanitary conditions and squatters, they wanted to replace the locale with a park. Ironic, I know. The Chinese locals living there appealed to the now nationalist government, who then lodged a complaint. The Hong Kong government hemmed and hawed, but eventually they would tear down much of the residences and eject the people. And then the Japanese, during their World War II occupation, would tear down the final remains of the walled city's wall to help build the Kai Tak airport. The Chinese Civil War resumed shortly after Hong Kong was returned to the British, and that triggered a surge of refugees into the colony. The refugees squatted anywhere they could, including the remains of the walled city. In 1948, the British expelled a few of those people back into the mainland, which set up intense Chinese nationalist sentiment. Students in Shanghai protested for 2 days, and the British consulate in Guangzhou was set on fire. The Hong Kong government thereafter realized that they were dealing with some nasty feelings whenever dealing with the walled city and walked on eggshells. And then a year later, the nationalist government collapsed and the Communist Party of China rose to power. The British came to face a brand new entity, its motives unknown, its reactions unpredictable. The tense relations between the Hong Kong government and the People's Republic would define efforts to clean up the walled city for decades thereafter. Whenever the British tried to do anything about the city, the locals would then protest to the Chinese, and the Chinese government would make their displeasure immensely well known. Let's talk about gentrification. The walled city has a general reputation for being a lawless land controlled by gangs, an isolated place that even the police feared to enter. Time magazine at the time even called it, quote-unquote, a universe apart. And that's kind of part of its nostalgic appeal, but the historical reality is way less dramatic. The walled city, for all of its name and supposed reputation of isolation, was never a self-contained entity. Tales of a 30,000-strong population living in the dark and in isolation do not make even the most elementary of sense. The reality is that most of its 30,000 quote-unquote residents lived in neighborhoods around the walled city and commuted there to work. The things sold there were made outside the city. It was well served by the bus and transit network. Hong Kong municipal employees entered the city several times a day to treat the water with chlorine, such and such. It was known to be a very well-connected part of the city. In the early 1950s, gangs did run gambling halls and brothels out of the walled city, taking advantage of its seeming protection from government interference. One gang hired drivers to prowl the cities of Hong Kong to bring people in so that they could frequent the gambling halls and prostitutes. The gangs were doing that all over the new territories post-war anyway. That was more of the sign of the times than the locale itself, as Hong Kong in general had been pretty chaotic back then. Hong Kong legal enforcement extended its legal jurisdiction to the walled city and its residents in 1859 with the landmark law case, and the police thereafter felt more comfortable entering the city. Not that it really mattered much to the people working there. The police into the 50s and the 60s were just as corrupt as the criminals they tracked. Nevertheless, the area began to gentrify into a working neighborhood for working poor folk. And as more positive relations developed between Britain and the People's Republic in the 1970s, the colonial authorities began to spend more time policing the walled city. The fire department made fire inspections, and the post office delivered mail regularly. It was only in the 1970s that the walled city began to take its final, most famous look. The reason for this is tied to, as it always is, the rising property costs in Hong Kong, as well as a quirk in the Hong Kong property tax law. Up until the 1960s, the walled city looked like just any other slum town, a bunch of low squatter homes and houses made of stone. Then Hong Kong property started getting really expensive, and residents driven out by rising rents looked for cheaper places to stay. Walled city landowners realized that they could maximize their rental income by building up and renting out the new places without incurring additional cost. Thus the walled city began to build up and up. The only thing that would stop them was a 150-foot height limit imposed by the Civil Aviation Authority due to the nearby Kai Tak airport. I remember reading something that said the property tax for a single landowner was something like $6. Xu Jiantun, head of the Xinhua news agency in Hong Kong and basically the Chinese representative in Hong Kong prior to the handover, patrolled the walled city in the 1980s and famously declared that the walled city was quote-unquote a good example of the Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. After the joint Sino-British declaration was signed, however, the Hong Kong government began to ponder more deeply about what to do about the walled city. With Hong Kong's fate is firmly established, the British thought it would be prudent to clean out the place before it could serve as a lightning rod for anti-British sentiment. Quote unquote, look how badly the British administration treated the Hong Kongers back in the day. The PRC, no longer needing to thump its chest and play the sovereignty card on behalf of its inhabitants, agreed. Negotiations were undertaken in secret over 2 years, and on January 14, 1987, it was suddenly announced that the walled city would be torn down and turned into a park before 1997. The PRC simultaneously announced its agreement with the plan, removing any chance for the walled city's residents to appeal. And they kind of wanted to appeal, because who wouldn't want to leave? The rent was great, something like 100 Hong Kong dollars or something at the time, and they had good transportation, you had bus networks and all that. Why would you want to leave? But that very same day, Hong Kong's policemen swept through the walled city, not to throw people out, but to take records of who lived and owned exactly which flat. The reason for this was that Hong Kong government had established a 2.3 billion Hong Kong dollar, equivalent to 350 million US dollars fund to compensate the current landowners, and the government wanted to foil any attempt to defraud the compensation fund. The final residents were evicted in 1992, and it was knocked down in April 1993. The Hong Kong government began the park in 1994 so that it would be ready for the handover in 1997, and it opened just in the nick of time, December 22nd, 1996, by the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten. You can visit it today and look at some of the artifacts and memorials of the legendary Kowloon Walled City. I really enjoyed making this particular video. I really enjoyed looking at all the photographs and to thinking about Hong Kong's past for a little bit. I hope to write a little bit more about this in the future, but I wanted to get this out because it was growing too long. I hope all of you are doing well. Stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.